Excellent. And again, this call is now being recorded. So let me again welcome everyone to this special DISCUS webinar on the production and compliance of manufacturing hand sanitizer. I'm pleased to be joined by the Gray Robinson team. So I'm going to turn control over to Richard Blau, who put together a crack team to address the various issues surrounding the production and compliance of manufacturing hand sanitizer. I also want to make a quick note. The DISCUS team is joined by Courtney Armour, our Chief Legal Officer, and Kelly Polson on our Federal Government Relations team, who will also be on hand to answer questions related to our advocacy as it relates to these issues. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Richard. Richard, take it away.
Thanks so much, Joe. My name is Richard Blau. I am the chairman of Gray Robinson's nationwide alcohol industry team, and I have with me colleagues who are former senior regulators from TTB, from state alcohol regulatory agencies, in this case, the Florida Division of Alcoholic Beverage and Tobacco, as well as lawyers who specialize in the laws that govern the alcohol industry. Together, we're going to try and go through, in a fairly compressed fashion, some of the current updates, including legal updates, regulatory updates, and practical updates on the production of hand sanitizer by alcohol producers and specifically DSPs. This PowerPoint is candidly loaded with information. I believe that DISCUS will, as Joe said, archive this presentation, which would include the PowerPoint itself. So don't feel compelled to rush to take notes. Access to the full PowerPoint. And by the same token, we're not going to cover in detail every fact point in every PowerPoint slide. There's just too much to handle in 1 hour, but you should know that you will have full access to the PowerPoint as we go forward. So with that, if Molly, we could go to the next slide. So here we are, and where we are is quite a roller coaster ride. This pandemic, COVID-19, is wreaking havoc all over the world. The U.S. is certainly not protected from it. In fact, the data that you see here in terms of confirmed positive reports of COVID-19 virus patients has already been superseded since this number was calculated this morning at 9 a.m. The new number is 175,067 confirmed positive cases of coronavirus. Reported deaths are actually up in the United States just in the past 5 hours to 3,178. It's a serious pandemic.
We will have full access to the PowerPoint.
Towards that end, want to make sure that everybody knows that DISCUS is doing a mighty job in terms of keeping the industry informed. On the right side of this slide, you see just a quick pic of the opening page for the DISCUS portal, the COVID-19 portal, and you've got the URL printed up under sub A of this slide. That is a resource that can tell you almost everything about anything related to COVID-19. I'm not sure if Kelly or someone from DISCUS wants to speak to that point, describe it in a little more detail. Well, if not, members of the audience and DISCUS members, you can certainly use that URL, click over to the COVID-19 portal, and you'll find it's a tremendous trove of information. Why we're talking today, the forecasted need for sanitizers is expected to be huge. An industry that was somewhat sleepy and specialized niche type industry has now blossomed into a $2 billion+ a year industry that's expected to have compounded annual growth of 7.5% or more through 2027. There's a huge need. Everybody you can think of, delivery people, UPS, maintenance workers, everyone is crying out for sanitizer, to say nothing of first responders and medical personnel. There's a huge demand. And happily, distillers are stepping up to the plate. Also on the DISCUS COVID-19 portal, there's a list of all the distillers who have made the effort to step in and produce sanitizer, so you can get a sense of how our industry is responding. But how do you respond? That's what we're going to try and talk about. Next slide, please, Molly. To put this in perspective, I think everyone has heard about the CARES Act. This is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act that was passed by Congress and went into law on March 27th of 2020. It's an 854-page piece of legislation that provides approximately $2 trillion in relief and assistance to industries, businesses, state governments, health providers, and others who are affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. That includes people who are responding to that outbreak, and that includes distillers that want to step up to the plate and start producing sanitizer, and specifically hand sanitizer, whether it's on a for-profit basis to produce and sell, or on a pro bono or contributory basis to make product in bulk, either for states or for hospitals or for release to the public in packaged goods. What we've done with this PowerPoint is to summarize for you some of the key points of this CARES Act. A lot of it relates to how you run your business, not necessarily the production of the hand sanitizer itself, but how you capitalize, how you stay liquid in terms of the ability to continue your business through these difficult times, how you deal with your employees, how you take care of them. The Act attempts to provide relief in all those areas. And I'll just quickly go through the subsections, but you will be free at your leisure to go through this in detail after the presentation. So on this first slide, we talk about the Small Business Administration's 7A program expansion. This is sometimes called the Paycheck Protection Program, to make loans available to businesses in connection with, suffering through what may very well be a serious recession. Likewise, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program has been expanded to deal with the trauma resulting from COVID-19 and this pandemic. Next slide, Molly. Other areas of the Act that would be relevant to you as distillers: the payroll tax deferral provisions, the employee retention credit, giving you refundable credits up to 50% of eligible employee wages if you can keep those employees on, as opposed to having to furlough or terminate them. Business losses provisions that provide for special carryback in taxation for losses caused by this circumstance, this pandemic. I think also the charitable contributions are addressed in the CARES Act, and that's important to the extent that you're going to produce hand sanitizer that you're going to give to the community, give to the state, give to first responders. Next slide, please, Molly. Other provisions, a so-called fix for the retail glitch in the 2017 tax bill that dealt with depreciation schedules for qualified improvements in mostly retail operations. And then perhaps most important for us on this call, the alcohol excise tax changes, the fact that the federal government is going to waive collection of federal excise tax on alcohol produced for the manufacturing of hand sanitizer, so long as you meet certain conditions. And that's what we'll talk about in the bulk of this presentation. Very quickly, additional provisions: the leave program modifications under the CARE Act for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, for workers that are laid off on or after March 1st, 2020, what kind of family benefits they're eligible for under federal payment, and bankruptcy code changes as well. We've gone through this really quickly. 854 pages, obviously takes a lot more detail. You can look at these slides at your leisure by going to the archive at DISCUS for the PowerPoint. And we put in a URL if you want more information. Gray Robinson, the law firm itself, has a COVID-19 reaction team, and they have substantive detail on this and many other provisions of the law that are affected by the pandemic. And we welcome you to visit that as well if you'd like more information. Next slide, please. So let's get into the details as they relate to COVID-19 and the federal government's response. We're going to start with the U.S. Alcohol Tax and Trade Bureau, obviously the agency that's near and dear to all of our hearts. And for that, I'm going to call on my colleague, Dave Bateman. Before leaving public service to join Gray Robinson, Dave was the industry specialist for the distilled spirits industry at TTB and had a long and successful career at ATF/TTB before leaving public service. Dave, can you talk to us about what TTB's position is on the production of hand sanitizer in this era of COVID-19 pandemic? Dave, are you there? Molly, is Dave muted or has he joined?
It looks like he's here. I don't think that he is, I think he's muted.
Hello, can you hear me now?
There we are.
Okay. Somehow I got muted in between. I apologize for that. Let's start with slide number 6, if we can, and try and explain what TTB's position is currently. We're dealing with 3 organizations, the World Health Organization, the Food and Drug Administration, and TTB concerning use of ethyl alcohol. Most of the members, I believe, of DISCUS are beverage alcohol permittees. Some have both the beverage alcohol permit and an operating permit. So you're familiar with what is required for industrial alcohol versus beverage alcohol. And some of the confusion in the last week is trying to separate or blend the use of ethanol, grain neutral spirits, alcohol. They're all going to be used synonymous when we're dealing with use of the ethanol itself to create a hand sanitizer. So if you do have questions on that at any time, please identify the incongruency in this thing so that we can keep it straight. We're dealing with use of ethanol or alcohol for industrial purposes to make an article, and an article is the first actual exemption that TTB issued last week. What an article is it's a product made with a specially denatured alcohol. And a specially denatured alcohol itself is in Part 21 of the TTB regulations. It has 50 different SDA formulas, or specially denatured alcohol formulas, that put in these bitternesses, these denaturants, whatever you want to call them, into ethyl alcohol so that it's not consumed for beverage purposes. And in each one of these 50 formulas, there are special denaturants that are authorized. There can be a choice of denaturants per SDA formula, or there can be simply one denaturant for a specific formula. After an SDA is made, an article itself has to obtain additional TTB approval. And that additional approval trying to clarify this a little better, for the hand sanitizer is the hydrogen peroxide and the glycerol. Those actual ingredients are not listed in TTB's authorized denaturants. And that requires an additional review by TTB and approval before an article can be made. So we've got an ethanol, which it can be a grain neutral spirit, and it's used for industrial purposes, in which a specially denatured alcohol is produced by adding an approved denaturant, and then a final product that has some use to industry or consumers is made, adding additional products to that. TTB has traditionally reviewed all of these to allow products to go out there. What kind of products are there? inks, gasoline. The list is innumerable, but each individual production takes a TTB approval. Last week, TTB eliminated that approval to make articles so that this hand sanitizer would not have to wait for TTB jurisdiction. That was the first exemption that was issued. Now, going from the first down to the most current exemption, on slide 6, it provides that alcohol can now not have to be denatured if it's going to state and local governments for non-beverage purposes or industrial purposes, however you want to refer to it. And then number 2, that the federal excise tax will not apply to undenatured alcohol if it goes to hospitals, blood banks, sanitariums, laboratories, and other and educational institutions. So that's the most recent exemption that TTB has allowed as of last Friday. Slide number 7 itself, tax-free alcohol must itself be denatured. Now, this is where it gets confusing, because just in slide number 6, it can be undenatured if it's going to a local government or if it's going to a hospital or an educational institution. But then in the first bullet on slide number 7 says it must be denatured. That's because of the interagency blend of our current dilemma we have between FDA and TTB. TTB is eliminating their roadblock in allowing undenatured or denatured alcohol to go without having to have tax attached to it. So they have said if the end product is going to be a hand sanitizer, the tax is gone. You won't have a tax liability. It does have certain provisos, certain things that have to be complied with, and that's what I'm going to try and go through as quickly as we can on this. So it must be denatured currently. You cannot make a hand sanitizer using undenatured alcohol, brain neutral spirits under the current guidelines as of March 31st. Now, that's not saying that this is not in flux and there are people are not looking for other means of allowing this, but as of today, no, it must be denatured. Okay, then we went back and repeated under the 6 bullets on slide number 7, repeated about the banks on bullet number 2 and bullet number 6. And the reason for that, if you look at bullet number 5 and 6 here, it's to produce hand sanitizer. So if you do provide undenatured ethanol to a state and local government, an educational institution, or a hospital, it must be for their intent to produce a hand sanitizer. It's not for them to use as an undenatured alcohol for other purposes. So how do you do that? My suggestion is, and this is not anywhere in any regulations, if you have a bill of lading or anything identifying that, use a best practices there to show that the intent of what you're sending them is to produce hand sanitizer. That's something that's not covered anywhere on this. It's just an additional suggestion. Okay, going back to bullet number 3, the formula is the article that I was talking about. That's been exempted. And the bullet number 4, it's all it's saying is the WHO has issued a formula that will work, and we're using that formula, keying in on that for the production of all the hand sanitizers listed. Slide number 8, guidance for alcohol fuel plants. The people are not familiar with an alcohol fuel plant. TTB actually issues 6 different types of DSP permits. The one that most of you are familiar with is the beverage distilled spirits plant issued under the Federal Alcohol Administration Act law for alcohol intended for beverage purposes. The second one, which is what we're talking about today, is the industrial alcohol permit that's used for non-beverage purposes. And the tax, although it stays attached to it, it can be released once an article is manufactured. So the tax stays attached for ethanol, denatured ethanol, and is released once the article is produced. TTB has exempted that for if the end point of this is to make hand sanitizers. Let's go on to slide number 9. I think we've repeated this 3 times. I think you can see that what the attempt was. The formula itself, there are 2 formulas that the WHO has put out there, and we're going to go into touch on this briefly. There's 2 out there. Before we get into that, formula number 1 talks about use of ethanol with 3 other ingredients to make the article. Formula number 2 talks about use of isopropyl alcohol. If there's no ethanol involved in the production of this, added to and removed later, and it's strictly isopropyl alcohol, TTB doesn't regulate isopropyl alcohol. So the only real regulation that they're looking at, an exemption that they're authorizing, is for the WHO formula number 1. Moving on to slide 10. They also talk about an industrial alcohol user. Most people are familiar with the importer, DSP, distributor or wholesaler permits that TTB issues, down to the state's purview for issuing state licensing under the beverage flow of distribution of alcohol. In the industrial end, it does still start with the DSP or the producer of the alcohol. Once it's produced and denatured, then it cannot be sold by the distiller. It can only be sold or distributed if it's made into an article. Normally, the bulk producers making these SBA, either a train car load, a truck load, barrel off 55-gallon drums, or in smaller packages to other people who have TTB permits as an industrial alcohol dealer or an industrial alcohol user. Why would we do that? Why did they do that? It's because bulk transportation reduces the expense, and the industrial alcohol users are the actual industry members that produce the majority of approved articles for industrial use. In addition to that, they can also package into industry or consumer usable sizes for a product and put out there, which is a hand sanitizer. The second bullet on slide number 10 deals with transfers in bond. Currently, TTB last week said if you do not need an approved transfer in bond. Most people in the industry are familiar. It lists the form 5100.16. TTB assigns that and approves it. Then you, as a supplier of ethanol, can provide it to another DSP or another AFP if approved. That no longer has a approval. They did say last week, submit the 5100.16 and don't wait for the approval. This week, they have eliminated that also, and you do not have to submit a copy of the form to TTB at any time during the exemption period. They're asking that you keep records of the receipt and any other information that would be required in the 5100.16. If you don't have a copy of that, all they're asking for is the name and address and permit number of the supplier, name and address and permit number of the receiver of the ethanol, whether there's bond coverage or bond coverage is exempted, and the maximum amount of alcohol that could have been sent to the receiving DSP. So if there's any questions on that, I don't see anything other than the fact that I encourage you to keep these records as detailed as possible. Blend them in with your normal records you have to keep of any alcohol distribution. Even though it's not required to be approved, 2 years from now when TTB looks at your activity, they may say, well, what record do you have of what you received or what you sent and were you authorized? So it's better to just keep the record as you did normally, except you don't need to have a copy of that approved 5116. Slide number 11. I'm going to turn this part over to for state and local guidance to John Harris, and Richard probably would want to make a better introduction of John than I could be capable of.
Dave, you did very well, but I will just say John is a former director of the Florida Division of Alcoholic Beverages and Tobacco, and as has been noted, there are special provisions now that allow alcohol producers to supply alcohol for hand sanitizer production to states, either to state governments directly or to hospitals, medical facilities, schools, and such. John, I'd like you to talk to the group about making sure that any DSP or any distiller that's producing alcohol in this capacity bears in mind the importance of not only federal compliance, but state compliance as well.
Thank you, Richard. Am I on?
You are. You're on.
Okay, thank you. What I want to go over briefly to give you all time to ask questions are being aware of state regulations on the manufacturing of sanitizers and getting it to the users in the various states that are in need of it. So some of the things that some due diligence should take place is whether or not the state taxes all alcohol or whether the state just taxes beverage alcohol. State statutes differ on this. Some allow the state regulatory agencies to have total control over any alcohol production and importing. Some just limit it to beverage alcohol. So it's a point of suppliers and wholesalers doing their due diligence to be sure that they've met all tax requirements for state taxes on alcohol. Some states require manufacturers of sanitizers, because it involves ethanol, manufacturing ethanol, to be permitted. Some states require a regular manufacturer's license. Some require a special permit so the state can keep up with where all the stills are and whether or not they're bona fide stills used for non-beverage purposes. Some states require nothing. Some states are not sure what they require, even though their statute may say that they are limited in regulating the production of alcohol beverages, and they create further exemptions for industrial products for which there's no tax and no regulatory power of the state. So another point of due diligence in addition to the state tax is what permits are required for the manufacturing and the importing of any substance that contains ethanol. The next issue is whether or not the user is required to have, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a sub-manufacturer that's going to take your ethanol and make hand sanitizers. Some states require user permits, some states do not. So it's another point of a checklist of whether or not you're in compliance and the user's in compliance when you ship it to them and showing your invoice who you're shipping it to. And if the user is required to have a permit, you list that permit number on your invoice. To get back to Dave's point, that record keeping is going to be the key to all of this for any kind of a future audit that may occur. The next point that I want to make is that a lot of states do not limit their tight house laws or trade practice laws to just alcohol. They're pretty broad in many states. In other words, they say any manufacturer of alcohol cannot do certain things. The normal thing is give no gifts, loans of money or property or rebates. So it shouldn't be another point on your checklist of whether the states enforce the trade practices when in fact you're dealing directly with retail dealers to determine whether or not the trade practices apply to those transactions and what you can and can't do that you ordinarily would be prevented from doing when you're selling alcohol beverages. The next issue on your checklist should be whether the states have a three-tier system for non-beverage alcohol. This goes back to how the state statutes are worded, whether it's all alcohol, whether it includes all alcohol products or whether it just includes alcohol beverage products. The The next thing on your checklist should be record keeping requirements for the state. That's a key, is to keep accurate and complete records of how much you make, how much you sell, who you sell it to, how you ship it, so that your records are very complete in the event that a tax question comes up on the ethanol by a state, that you can clearly show that it was exempt from taxation. And then finally, on your checklist should be the monthly report requirements, whether or not you're importing it into a state, you're making it in a state, what monthly reports are required of you by that state on the ethanol that you're producing. Dave, I'd like to get back to you on one thing to clarify, and that is the importation of hand sanitizers and whether or not that is regulated by the FDA or TTB when it contains ethanol.
That's an avid question. The importation itself, if the hand sanitizer is being imported and it complies with FDA requirements for the formulas, it would be considered an article that has a tax release and is no longer under TTB's review. If it is something that's in progress or does not meet the expectations, then the FDA may look at the product to see whether it's a safety issue for the U.S. public, or in fact that there has to have additional manufacturing conducted, and then who can conduct that additional manufacturing.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, John. Appreciate that input. Molly, if we could go to the next slide, I want to introduce my colleague, Charlie Tull, another former senior regulator, other direction for the slides. Another senior regulator from U.S. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau and ATF before that, a distinguished career in public service, now with Gray Robinson. Charlie is going to talk about something that maybe never would have been considered 10 or 20 years ago, and that is the possibility of working between a DSP for a distillery and maybe cooperating with a brewery or a winery with regard to aggregating alcohol for the production of hand sanitizer. In today's world, a lot of industry members are crossing segments. They have common ownership between a winery and a distillery, or a distillery and a brewery, or maybe even all three. Charlie, can you talk about how under these pandemic times, those entities can work with one another to maximize the production of alcohol for hand sanitizer?
Well, thanks, Richard. I think the reason that we included this slide and the next slide is we felt like it was important for distillers to understand or realize that they can source wine and beer tax-free for use in the production of the high-fruit alcohol that is going to be used or is required to be used in the production of the hand sanitizer. And as the demand increases for these products, sourcing material, producing the high-fruit alcohol is going to be a problem. And so we felt like it was important for distillers to take advantage of that cost tier, if you will, or that ability without any kind of regulatory approval. That's in the regulations. You can do that today if you wanted to. So the importance of this slide and the following slide is to make them aware that you are able to get tax-free wine or tax-free beer as a source material for the production of the high-fruit alcohol.
And then, of course, under slide 15, Charlie, you being a maven when it comes to documentation and reporting, might be worth a word to the wise to everybody to again reinforce the point that record keeping is key.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's a tendency in this pandemic and this emergency to probably overlook that. And TTB and the FDA have indicated, a relaxation of enforcement efforts at this point, but we don't know down the road. So word of the caution, make sure that you spend a little time on the record keeping requirements on compliance.
Good advice, Charlie. Good advice. We heard earlier from Dave that FDA obviously played an important role in shaping the policy for going forward with the production of alcohol for hand sanitizers. And there's a little bit of dissonance between TTB's approach, FDA's approach. They do have a consensus now for purposes of going forward. And I'd like Anna Wyan, a member of our alcohol industry team, to clarify those points and make clear to the audience just what FDA's role is and what they've said and how you all need to comply with FDA guidelines. Just an FYI, in addition to having been a federal judicial clerk, Anna was an FDA staff attorney before, again, leaving public service to join Gray Robinson's team. Anna, can you tell us about what we need to know from the FDA?
Sure thing. And I would just first off like to clarify that I was, when at FDA, I specialized in food and feed products as opposed to over-the-counter drugs, which in a typical world, that is what hand sanitizers are classified as by FDA. So it's sort of important, I think, to keep that in the back of your mind is when we get out of this state of emergency, additional requirements would apply if you wanted to continue to produce these products. But at this time, FDA has recognized the huge demand on these products and has issued two relevant to this particular group temporary policy documents or guidances, as we typically call them, outlining how firms like alcohol beverage producers can make hand sanitizers during the public health emergency. If we want to go to the next slide, as Richard noted in the onset, the CARES Act requires that these products be produced in accordance with these FDA guidance documents. And although, as we've discussed, or we will discuss further, FDA has contemplated the use of some additional denaturants, despite current pressures that I know DISCUS in particular, I think, has been applying upon the agency. At this point, they are continuing to insist on the use of denatured alcohol only to be used in the ultimate hand sanitizer product. And this concern stems from the idea that children might consume these products. I guess they may be more palatable if the alcohol is not denatured. And apparently there have been issues in the past with children consuming a hand sanitizer and being poisoned and potentially even fatally. So that's where the FDA is coming from. And on the next slide, I would just note that in my experience with the agency, to see how quickly these guidance documents have been released and then updated, the two guidances that we'll get into, at least one of them in much more detail, were updated as recently as last Friday, is pretty fast from what I've seen from the FDA. So I think it is possible that they're continuing to work with the industry, which is good. As noted in the guidance documents, they are relaxing some of their current policies with respect to approving denatured formulas, the proof of the alcohol being used in hand sanitizer, the grade of the alcohol, and the grade of the hydrogen peroxide. Moving on to the next slide, and trying to go fast here because I think the devil's in the details, and Dave's going to get into those some more. But as mentioned, there are two guidance documents that are relevant. The first is the one that we have an image of here. It's the temporary policy for preparation of alcohol-based hand sanitizers. So this would be what you would reference if you want to make the hand sanitizer. There's a second guidance document that speaks to policy if you want to manufacture alcohol for incorporation into a hand sanitizer. I noticed, Courtney, you provided a link. DISCUS has these materials on their website. I behoove anyone who wants to venture into this sphere to follow them quite closely. Keep an eye on DISCUS website, keep an eye on the FDA website. The agency is moving quickly. Pursuant to these guidance documents, at this point, you can produce these products as long as you produce them in accordance with the guidance and the factors that we're going to go through. If you don't adhere to those circumstances, you risk enforcement action. If you do follow the guidance documents, FDA is going to exercise enforcement discretion, meaning no adverse enforcement action. However, they're only exercising this enforcement discretion until the public health emergency is over. I think we all, quite frankly, hope that is soon. But with the way things are moving these days, I just highly recommend trying to keep as up to date as possible on the guidance that's out there. Maybe we can go on to the next slide. Again, as mentioned, for the production of hand sanitizers to be used for consumer use or for healthcare personnel rubs, there's about 8 different circumstances outlined in the guidance document. Dave will dig into those now, and I'll throw some insights out as we go through them. But of course, I suspect we might have some questions at the end. So we'll move on to the next slide, and Dave, it's all yours.
Thank you. There's 2 listings here, and it's the manufacturer of the following ingredients, and it's the same WHO formulas number 1 and 2. However, there is a little bit of a change. If you look at the WHO formula, it required that the ethanol itself be 96%. And in the footnote number 1 of the hand sanitizer number 1 here, it's listed at 94.9%. That's 189.8 proof for those people in the beverage alcohol end of it, looking at that. And we all know that if you normally purchase bulk ethanol, and it's provided by most of the major suppliers of bulk ethanol, it comes out about 191 to 192. I've seen 191.3 is pretty consistent when you receive bulk grain neutral spirits. So to say that, and that is beverage grade, that is not necessarily USP grade, and the FDA makes that determination, not TTB. TTB only requires that a alcohol used for denaturing purposes be at a 185 proof or higher. Now, if those people who are in the industry for industrial alcohol realize there's a 200 proof alcohol out there and there's a 190 proof alcohol out there, those are the 2 main requirements for industrial alcohol. This ethanol does fit within that, in that 189.8. If you come out with exactly 190, those people who operate or actually work with ethanol realize there's a natural drop anytime you start blending or mixing something. So it does fit as a beverage alcohol. It is allowable to be used in the WHO formula number 1. Formula number 2, as I said, isopropyl does not fit any TTB review. So we're only looking at that. Can you register with the FDA at a later time if you have an alcohol that meets their USP guidelines and also meets the 96% WHO guidelines? That's still work in progress. I don't think we have answers to all of that. And to throw another question out there, a lot of people that produce alcohol for fuel purposes, most engines won't run any alcohol unless it's 195 proof or higher. And the majority of alcohol produced for fuel purposes now are around 199.3 to 199.7. In other words, it's 99.7%, 99.8% pure. How does that fall within that? We don't have an answer on that yet. I don't think people are looking for answers for that. I would only use this as a reference if you plan on registering with the FDA and continuing to produce these products. Let's go on to slide number 3. Point number 3, slide 22. The final product itself has no real reference to proof, USP standards, TTB standards, grade standards. It's simply that the ethanol in the final formula be at least 80% of the volume of everything that's in the formula, which includes water. So you've got a 1.5% glycerin. If you're mixing it, we're used to 100-gallon batches. They were talking about 10-liter batches. If you do it on 100-gallon batches, you put 1.45 gallons of glycerin and 0.125 gallons of hydrogen peroxide in with ethanol, and you make the rest water such that it gets down to the ethanol volume as 80% of the actual hand sanitizer formula. Okay, moving on to slide number 23. let's keep going. I think we're at a point where I want to get down farther into the actual formulas themselves. And there are emergency guidelines. They're listed on slide number 24. Appendix A and C apply to ethyl alcohol. B and D is isopropyl. Those are there for your reference if you wanted to go into that further.
Dave, I can jump in here real quick. These
Okay.
two requirements are under the FDA guidance documents, and they're a little specific. This is number 7 is a labeling requirement, and number 8 is a registration requirement. You must register both your facility and your products. I think most of us are used to licensing requirements that often are time consuming. This is a registration, so you should receive automatic confirmation from FDA, and then you may begin to manufacture. The idea behind this is to track where these products are, and it's akin to what FDA would do with drugs typically in our world. So just diving a little bit deeper into the labeling requirements on slides 25 and 26. These are actually reproductions of what appears in the appendices of the guidance document. FDA, in many respects, has made it a little bit easy in terms of this is the drug facts panel label that you need to put on your hand sanitizer product to be in compliance with the FDA guidance documents. The one thing I would definitely caution everyone is limit any additional claims or verbiage on your hand sanitizer. I mean, of course, you can label who produced it, and you should, but you want to be very wary of making any additional claims, as this will put you outside of the sort of four corners of the guidance document and potentially open you to enforcement action. And then on slide 27, sorry to jump a bit, but we're running out of time, I see. So again, I think you've heard us mention many times that both FDA and TTB's guidance documents have relied on the World Health Organization recommendations and formulas for these hand sanitizer products. Here, and I'll let Dave speak to this, but essentially we have an example of how you might scale the WHO formula. And Dave, I think we'll let you get back into the details there.
Sure. Yeah, most people are familiar with beverage alcohol. It's a bid sheet. What you're looking at is the specs of what's in the product, and this is the specs that they're looking at for the hand sanitizer. Let's move on quickly to slide number 28. It talks about there again the formulas, the ingredients in here, and then down the last bullet is denatured. And denatured, this is what I wanted to get into. If you look under Part 21 of the TTB regulations, you've got 50 FDA, SDA formulas that you can use. And if you look under the uses, each use has a code assigned to it. There are 2 codes that I looked at that are relative, code number 224 and code number 410. Code number 224 will give you 4 SDA formulas that are used as an anesthetic. And code number 410 will give you 13 formulas that can be used as a disinfectant. 3 out of the 4 on 224 overlap with 410. So you only have 1 out there that doesn't actually fit both of them. If you look down, all 3 of the formulas listed here, 40A, 40B, and 3C, are under code use 410 as a disinfectant. So that's the way the TTB had regulated this before this pandemic started. And it looks like that using, going to slide 29, using one of these 3 formulas, what's being recommended and what's being accepted right now. 40A is, and we're not going back to the 10 liter anymore. We're going back to the 100 gallons because that's what the Part 21 always uses as a guideline. For 100 gallons of alcohol, they tell there's 2 denaturants that have to be put in there. 40B, there's 2 denaturants. They're almost the same. You use the terbutyl alcohol, but you can use a Daytonium benzoate in one and a sucrose I can't even say that, octacetate on the other one. Formula 3C would seem to be the one that would be the most acceptable because you're only using 5 gallons of isopropyl to put into 100 gallons of ethyl alcohol. And WHO formula number 2 is accepting isopropyl, which would seem like a good on paper fit. What the problem is, the isopropyl is going to be in short supply also. And I've had some industry input that they're having problems obtaining that much, 5 gallons for each 100 gallons of the hand sanitizer. So it may not be a solution. I think FDA is still working on the 4 different denaturants that are out there. There are 15 different SDA formulas and probably 40 different denaturants in those 15 formulas. They are now looking at 23A or acetone may be used as a denaturant. That has not been approved yet that I'm aware of. So we're not really at that point yet, but it is being looked at.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Dave, as of yesterday, the FDA has still rejected the use of acetone. So it's important for everybody to recognize that under the CARES Act, the only formulas that are approved for FET excise tax exemption are going to be those that FDA has given the green light to. In the interest of time, we need to skip ahead. There are slides that deal with how to actually produce based on WHO criteria and such.
Richard?
Yes, Joe.
I'm sorry to cut you off. We have a couple of questions in one particular area, so I was hoping we could just circle back to those. And I think it was covered on whomever covered slide 24. It's about the registration process.
Okay.
And I was wondering if we could just maybe circle back to that slide and talk a little bit about that, because we do have a number of questions about that very same topic.
Okay, this is Anna here.
Please. Yes.
This is the registration process. I saw that question pop up. To be candidly, I haven't personally done the registration process myself. I have resources and would be able to navigate someone through that. However, I think my understanding is that it's essentially providing information about your facility, location, the products you are producing, in an effort to allow FDA to track these products. And then, as you'll see in the red down below, FDA does have an adverse reporting hotline that facilitates, in the event, something should be wrong with a product of this nature, so we can track down where that's at and get it out of the system if it is something that is truly dangerous. So I apologize, I don't have great detail on this right now, but I welcome emails and I can get you some more specifics on that and help you navigate that process. I'd be happy to help. And this is Anna Wyand.
Joe, does that work?
It does, definitely. And as we get that information, we can also, post that on the website along with the presentation. The one other question we had that just came through was with our previous speaker on the denaturants. And his question was, how is the 80% by volume being defined specifically when using a solid denaturant such as sucrose, unpronounceable by me?
Dave, you want to handle that?
Is it dissoluble? That's one of the things. The sucrose is normally a dissoluble product, and the specific gravity of the ethanol itself will change based on the amount of soluble hard or solid that is introduced into the ethanol. So that the change in specific gravity is the means of measuring that.
Okay.
Great.
So, Joe, we've got less than a minute left, and there's an awful lot of additional material. We might want to consider having a part 2 to this presentation, and I'll leave that to you and DISCUS to decide. But again, I remind everybody that the content of the PowerPoint itself is available to members through DISCUS, and if there are additional questions, we will always be available to answer them.
Thanks, Richard. We can certainly explore that. If you have a couple of more key points that you think you wanted to cover, we can do that in the next 2 to 3 minutes, and then we can open it up for questions. I defer to you on.
Well, let's do that. 2 really important points. Number 1, to slide 34, Molly, if you could take us there. We've talked about TTB and we've talked about FDA, but OSHA has an important role to play as well. And for anybody that's going to produce alcohol, you've got to make sure you take certain precautions one of which is the creation of an MSDS safety data sheet, specifically relating to the hand sanitizer that you're going to be producing. And this PowerPoint contains an actual example of an MSDS for hand sanitizer, give you a sense of the detail that's involved in that. And then I would suggest shifting down to slide 44, and I'll introduce my colleague, Elizabeth DeConti, a partner with Gray Robinson and a key member of our alcohol industry team. Because once you produce this product, what do you do with it? How do you store it? How do you get it out of your facility? And how do you let people know about it? Elizabeth, do you have time to talk to us about that?
Thank you, Richard. So quickly, the issues we're trying to address here are almost a summary, if you will, of some of the things that my colleagues have been talking about. We are talking about a product that is made with alcohol, but the storage rules around this product are not the same as the products that you ordinarily make. So be aware that at least for the time being, this product can be stored away from the licensed premises if space considerations are a concern. Note also, with thoughts about logistics being top of mind, that your product does not have to be transported in consumer-friendly containers. It can be transported for easier distribution in bulk containers and repackaged elsewhere. And finally, we added a point here about record keeping. I think you have heard my colleagues speak at every step of this process, how detailed record keeping is extraordinarily important. And there are a few places that it is very important. The first place I would point out to you, and I know that my colleague Dave Bateman mentioned this earlier, is that it's critically important to mention on bills of lading and other documents that products that you are shipping are hand sanitizer. And so, you know, we are not going to be in this terrible situation forever. You are still making other products in conjunction with the hand sanitizer process, and you need to keep clear records of all of your manufacturing processes, and perhaps not commingle those records that deal with hand sanitizer with those that are for other products. And in the event of audits down the line, routine or otherwise, those records will be extremely helpful to you. The last point, and again, you know, this is something that we could spend a lot more time on if we had the time, is how to get the word out about your good efforts. So obviously, when we think about upper tier members conducting advertising activities, getting the word out is certainly an advertising activity on one level. I'm not really talking about how you would let people know that you are available for this type of service. I'm really more talking now about touting those efforts, which there's no reason why you should not do that. A couple of points in our conversation that I will redirect you back to. The first one was something touched on by my TTB colleagues about this product not being an article, quote unquote, for the purpose of the FAA Act. That means not only that you have the ability to give it to lower tier members, but your advertising around it may not be the same as advertising your other products. And so although certainly you can see state advisories and even federal advisories since the COVID-19 crisis began talking very strongly about tied house rules not being suspended during this crisis, we need to think carefully about how these products do or don't fit into those regulations. And finally, the last thing I would say on the point of getting the word out is to echo what my colleague Anna Wyand said. Certainly claims about the health or potency of a hand sanitizer is not something that you want to get into at this time because of the potential FDA repercussions. I think what you want to do is stick to a message about the fact that you are making it and the fact that you are helping the crisis. And with that, Richard, I'm afraid I probably have to stop because I think we have come to the top of the hour.
Yep, you're right, Elizabeth, but you're also right that there's so much more to discuss about that, and that's something that perhaps DISCUS may pursue at a later date. Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you. The last slide of the PowerPoint deck is one that talks about supporting other industry members and record keeping. Always a good advice and always a good thing. I hope everybody will take it to heart. And with that, Joe, I'll let you wrap it up.
Thank you, Richard. And before we land the plane, so to speak, if your team has a few more minutes and folks on the line, Molly, can you open up the lines and see if we have any questions on the phone? So we'll give that a moment. Let me also turn it over to Courtney briefly. Courtney is DISCUS's Chief Legal Officer, who you've seen on the chat and is responsible for much of the work on the resources page at the DISCUS website. Courtney, did you have any thoughts or concluding comments here?
I just wanted to thank the Gray Robinson team for this tremendous overview. It's a lot to cover and there's a lot of moving parts here, and we absolutely appreciate them making themselves available and their expertise available to our members. We'll certainly explore part 2 if that's appropriate. But the DISCUS team is also working very closely with FDA and TTB and other government agencies to try to resolve any regulatory hurdles or friction with getting these great products out to the market. One thing to note is the Department of Transportation is developing some streamlined guidance and policies around hazardous material handling and transportation. And we should be seeing that very soon. There are, as the Gray Robinson team here has explained, there are other rules and regulations people need to be mindful of, and that is one of them with transporting and handling these otherwise hazardous materials. So be on the lookout for updated guidance around that very shortly. And they have also offered to put together a webinar for training your employees on how to handle these materials. So it's normally an 8-hour all-day training, but they are going to try to condense it down to something as short as 30 to 60 minutes. So we will be following up with that later in the week. So definitely be on the lookout for that, and keep checking back on the DISCUS website on our COVID-19 page, where we have all of these great resources, including our document that is tracking all of the different regulatory guidance documents that are coming out and seem to be updated on a very regular basis. So we're doing our best to keep that up to date. So please keep checking back there for the most current information.
Thank you, Courtney. And just one more question, if I can leverage the Gray Robinson team since we have you on the phone, or Courtney. Has the FDA approved the use of undenatured or denatured alcohol coming from a fuel ethanol plant in the use of hand sanitizer? Does it have to be FCC or USP grade?
So what we've heard, that the new guidance that the FDA has just updated last week on the 27th now allows for industrial grade as well, as long as you ensure that there are no other additives in it. Another topic of great concern around the country right now is just an ethanol shortage to make hand sanitizers and other disinfectants. So one project that DISCUS is working on is developing a working group around redistilling fuel grade ethanol so that it brings it up to the appropriate standards and can be used in these products. And we have some very promising results. So please reach out to me if you're interested in being part of that project, where we would help solve the ethanol shortage by tapping into these huge surpluses of fuel ethanol.
Excellent. And Molly, were there any other questions on the phone?
Doesn't sound like it.
So, Joe, this is Richard. If Molly could take us back to slide number 1. Gray Robinson, I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. And I'd like to, again, recommend to all the members of the audience, all the members of DISCUS, to check out that DISCUS portal. It's tremendously valuable. I know that Courtney and her team are keeping everything up to the minute in real time. She was on the phone with FDA yesterday afternoon on issues involving what the agency would and wouldn't accept under its new guidance. And frankly, we found a lot of the information that we used in our presentation today through the assistance of Courtney and through the assistance of the DISCUS portal. So it's a recommendation to everyone. That I should have said second slide, Molly. That's the one that has the URL for the DISCUS portal and the sample of the opening page. There you go. So thanks to you all.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you to your entire team and to Courtney. And most importantly, thank you to our members who have an interest in this topic in the interest of helping our communities. So we thank you all. And again, as Richard noted at the beginning, this webinar, the slides and resources will be posted on our website as soon as we can get it up there. Please reach out to us if you have any questions, and have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, Gray Robinson team.
Thanks, everybody.